Hello again, everyone. You're listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Jeff Mix. I'm Executive Platform's Head of Content and Research. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Hutson. Andrew is the COO of QFlow Systems, as well as a professor at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Andrew is an authority and thought leader on artificial intelligence, workflow automation, knowledge graphs, document and records management, enterprise knowledge management, and data visualization from both his academic and business careers. He holds a PhD in informatics from the MU Institute of Data Science and Informatics at the University of Missouri, and he has done groundbreaking research in clinical decision-making and the impact of data visualizations at the point of care. I know we have listeners who work in all sorts of roles across all sorts of industries. Whatever your background and responsibilities, a universal theme connecting every executive in our network these days is a hunger for insights into AI and data analytics. I'm confident this is going to be a great episode with someone who is actively working to push the theoretical and practical applications of those tools. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Just before we get too far into things, I'm always fascinated when I get a chance to speak to someone who has been working for a long time and has deep expertise in something that suddenly has a moment in the spotlight where many people think of it as relatively new. How long have you been working in areas related to AI and data analytics? Where did you start, and what is the story of how you came to be where you are today?
Thanks for asking, by the way. For me, I was thinking about this as that question comes up in my childhood is probably where this started. My father put himself through college later in life at 39 and became a CPA. And that's when we were looking at spreadsheets in between playing Doom on the laptop. So that might age me a little bit there for the folks listening. I think I really got into it, however, just before graduate school, because a couple of things that I did. I read about the changing landscape for competition across global interconnectedness. And a book came to mind of The World is Flat. I thought it was a history book by Thomas Friedman. It was not. It was an evaluation of how the easy access to data information in the early 2000s is now horizontally creating competition rather than everything trickling down vertically. I was fascinated by this because it really meant to me that anybody could then compete if they could master what was going on with this access to information. So from there, I hopped into graduate school and I looked at healthcare because I thought it would be meaningful to understand how to help doctors make better decisions at the point of care. And that's really what got me into the industry, is wanting to help remove patient errors, medication conflicts, misdiagnosis, simply because the information available was too difficult to process and digest with the time given to physicians.
As someone who has exposure to these tools and technologies from both an academic and business perspective, what has surprised you the most about AI's sudden explosion into the public consciousness over the last year and a half?
Well, I think the easy pickings there is ChatGPT and 1 million users in something like 5 days. I think that might have been the biggest surprise. What I thought was really smart about it is how they captured the imagination through an interface that was really approachable to most people. Most folks who have a cellular device, have a desktop, they're used to chatting. They're used to sending messages. That's heck, even me when first starting with a computer, AOL chat. I mean, we all had that, dialing in, and you got to talk with some folks around the world. It's how we're used to interacting without having a job behind it. And I think that was really interesting how they chose to take a model that had been 10 to 11 years in refinement and making it so approachable to so many people. That's probably the biggest surprise I had.
It's so interesting that you say that, because one of the most exciting things I hear from technology-minded leaders is perhaps the biggest impact AI is making, at least in its early days, is it brings built-in enthusiasm to the conversation, because there are some of the people who are usually hardest to get on board with digital solutions, like C-suite executives or frontline workers, where they're not really thinking, okay, well, what is digital transformation going to do to me? a machine learning pilot project might have withered on the vine 5 years ago because people didn't want to engage with it. They didn't want to put the capital in to scale it up. And now it feels like those same people are the ones who are the most excited about artificial intelligence. And I wonder if you could talk about your experience with that.
Oh, sure. Thanks for teeing that up for me. I think the experience, and maybe we need to change our language here a little bit, back to machine learning, decision trees, even probabilistic decision making. All of that has existed 20 or more years. The You hit the nail on the head, however, is that it was not approachable to most people. You had to become an expert. You had to get a PhD to feel comfortable and understand how these things worked. Um, the For example, you mentioned interacting with the data with executives in a way that we never have before. That worked with Power BI for Microsoft 2014, 2015. They already had a way that you could type in uh, human understandable language and it would produce a report. The problem was it kind of wasn't very good at it. And the reason it wasn't very good wasn't that the technology was poor, it's because most organizations don't have their information structured and stored in a way that makes it approachable and predictable for any model. And it took so much time for the approach that was first published in 2012 on something called generative pre-trained transformers. And how this works is it takes a corpus of data and then puts it through a series of probabilistic matrices. Now that sounds very approachable, right? Everybody probably knows what I'm talking about right now. But what all that means is that when it sees some information and it goes through 90 or 120 of these transformers, it is predicting the next best word part to put up. That's great. It's not very smart, but man alive, does it demo really well. And that's probably the next big thing that's coming up is the enthusiasm is there because of the use cases that have been introduced and highlighted in a lot of the media. However, when it comes down to actually getting something contextual to me, my business, it starts to fall short because it cannot have your context unless you've given your data and you've given it in a way that the system can interpret, understand, and incorporate. And so what you get is about what they call them hallucinations. And what a hallucination is, you probably saw it with like Gemini when they said to make your pizza stickier, add Elmer's glue, right? Not a great bit of advice, but you can understand how it would make that leap because, well, sticky and glue, and obviously you put those together, but no, because I can't eat Elmer's glue, right?
Right.
We know that as humans, but the system's not going to know that. And that's because it didn't have the context. And that's going to be the real big differentiator coming up as we have all these things available. Someone is going to have to figure out how you protect your contextual information as a competitive advantage and use these trained models that have millions of dollars put into them to get them to the state that they're in. I can't believe, for example, like Olama 3 has been out there open sourced. Because if you look at just the compute power over time to make that, you're talking 20, 30, $40 million of just compute time to go through and train that set. So may have went on a tangent there a bit, but I think it's important to realize that the hype is great and people jump in on it because they can have those use cases. However, when you start the rubber meets the road, so to speak, it doesn't do too well.
I think it's a terrific point, and I could go in a couple of different directions with it. My first thought, I guess, would be, and speaking to your background with data visualization and knowledge graphs, Executive Platforms organizes industry events for senior leaders in a number of different roles and industries. And one of the things that I keep hearing over and over again is all sorts of different professions, what's really happening for them in terms of it being a game changer is that it's going to be able to illustrate and communicate what the data has to say in a simple and persuasive way, where earlier iterations of data analytics required, as you were saying, like specific training to understand what the throughput and output was saying. The idea of actually just being able to simply communicate with the tool and being given an answer in a conversational way is just opening a lot of doors, changing a lot of hearts and minds. I wonder if we can speak about that a little.
When we think about the financial sector and some of the instances that you and I have talked about in the past, the ability to dive into a huge corpus of data and use these chat models, large language models, to ask it questions in a manner that in the past would have taken an expert to go do for you. There's a door that opens that I think is potentially a double-sided blade. That yes, this is fast. Yes, this seems largely right. And yes, I can process the information that it gives back to me faster. The opposite side of that is the system may not necessarily know, we'll say, that the response it's giving is accurate. So in a financial industry, you can see that there's different models that are specializing into specific industries to reduce the likelihood that the responses provided are hallucinations or just flat out wrong. And the reason that that's important is we would naturally believe what it would say to us because most of the time it's accurate. Humans would trust it. And I think that's where folks are potentially overestimating the capability of some of these tools in their day-to-day work. And I think over the next decade, maybe faster, you'll start to see more and more specific groups. And once those become more commonplace and stable, you may get into the future of artificial general intelligence because you're able to take these specific domains and combine them together. And I think that's the trajectory that we're mostly on.
So a thing you've touched on a little bit, and again, it fascinates me, the idea that there is an emerging expertise, people who know how to engage with AI and get the most out of it, almost sort of an AI interlocutor, right? In the same way, IT back in the day used to be about having incredibly, detailed technical knowledge. And, at some point it became how fast can they identify the problem and Google what to do about it. The people who are good at the search engine became better IT professionals. A lot of executives are looking at this and saying, okay, well, if I get great at asking AI the right questions in the right way, I'm going to get a better response out of it. Can we talk about that? The idea of like learning that new skill set to engage with the tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the role that at least I've heard out there is called a prompt engineer.
Ah.
So folks that are specializing in how they construct their query, I guess you could call it, or how they construct their prompt to produce the expected output. And the more refined that you get at that, the better result you can expect. And I think that that's a thing that's going to emerge. And what needs to be paired with that is likely the data science roles that we've heard in the past when business intelligence was such a big thing. I don't think prompt engineering by itself is a role. I think it's a skill that gets added or combined to those data engineer, data science roles we have today. The reason why I don't think it's its own expertise is the background knowledge, skills, and abilities required to construct a meaningful prompt is only improved when you have a better understanding of how the models operate. And to understand how the models operate, you need a broader background, a broader set of education, either self-educated or not. You need to understand how these things are constructed so that your prompts don't go down a rabbit hole. And if anybody has spent any time using ChatGPT on maybe you have something you wanted to ask it, it was perfect right out of the bat. It gave you exactly what you wanted. And then 2 chats later, you keep sitting there and saying, no, that's not right. This is the way I want it. If anybody's experienced that, I know I have. That's because, however, that model is trained in the way in which I'm communicating and asking for what I want don't pair up. So there's going to be some of that learning and adjustment over time with these roles that currently exist around getting those insights.
So, another big issue I hear over and over again is how this is helping companies understand and improve what is happening at the grassroots level. So, in real time, some of it is, AI can figure out how to automate, which frees up workers to do more valuable tasks, or even giving them guidance on how to be proactive. There are also use cases where generative AI tools are taking on some of the coaching, mentoring, and on the job training elements new hires need in a world where more and more of the senior people are retiring or otherwise moving on to other opportunities. I've been talking about the industrial Internet of Things and digital transformation programs for more than a decade now, but this really does sound like an enormous step forward in capabilities. In your experience, how much of this is already happening? What should we be expecting in terms of like this is going to become mainstream? Where do you think this is all going? What is the next capability as this sort of thing moves from, wouldn't it be great if it worked like this, to, well, we're already doing it, what's next?
Yeah. What sparked in my mind was an example one of my brothers shared with me. One of my brothers is an engineer in manufacturing. So he was a VP of reliability engineering at one point, and he was explaining to me how he would put over 200 sensors on these large manufacturing lines to understand the right time to intervene with maintenance so that he could schedule it and um, change or replace or repair a part along the system to optimize uh, uptime for the entire line. Because in manufacturing, every single time you have to shut something down and fix it, you're losing money. Just the way it is. He was doing that 10 years ago. And the sensors and the interpretation of those things at the front line, he had a tool that he could use to help him understand that. If we're talking about how AI is coming in to interpret that, it's kind of already been involved and put in. It just isn't called AI. So
Right.
some of those examples are getting clumped under that AI terminology, which I think is fine. I mean, people can call it however they want, but the techniques and approaches to get predictive insight has been around a very, very long time. And then the second thing that you've talked about, I would say the past 5 years or so has really gotten a lot of attention, and that's maturing up to prescriptive data. So if we think of a chart as presenting data, I can see it. The next forecast you could talk about is predicting. So, hey, based on what happened before, I think this might happen next. And then the final is maturity level is prescribing. So not only do I think this is going to happen, here's what you should do next. I think as we are maturing in our processes within an organization, that will naturally be aided by what we've clumped as AI today. The barrier that I see in practice for most companies, because I have had a background in consulting and working with data from small organizations all the way up to big folks like Little Caesars and Ascension Healthcare and things like this. Uh, the way in which they're organizing that data is not constructed in a way that would help you predict or prescribe an outcome. What I mean by that is uh, you need to be able to have the activities or attributes, and then you need to have the outcomes, and you need to be able to connect those two concepts together. So this set of activities produce this outcome. And you have to have enough of those examples that you can then train one of these models to say, hey, probably this is the right next thing to do based off of the training set that you gave me. Companies that don't have that are going to fall behind in their competition, because as much as they want to use these new tools and we capitalize on this fervor, if they aren't prepared or haven't been putting the work in rather to organize that towards this future, they got a lot of catch up to get to now, because now more people can use it than you can, and they've already invested in organizing their corporate data sets towards this outcome.
Let's talk about QFlow specifically for a moment so we can get into a few specifics about how much is changing and what is possible. QFlow helps businesses with document management and records management, which sounds like a space where these new capabilities are really going to have an impact. Of course, you don't need to mention any clients by name, but tell us some of the challenges and opportunities they have when it comes to documents and records management that this next generation of tools is going to help them address.
Yeah, thanks for asking about QFlow. A little bit of background on the company. We just had our 24-year anniversary.
Oh, happy
Um,
anniversary.
well, thank you, thank you. The team was really pleased with it, and they definitely earned the scar tissue through those 24 years as a technology company. Um, the areas that we've focused on right now, uh, with that we see our end users facing, is the burden of categorizing their unstructured data. And I'm using those words carefully because when we think about a document, it's not conducive to a database, for example, which would be structured. I mean, you can think of a Google Doc that you wrote recently. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. And how do I pull out the important parts to then know and train a computer how to predict some type of outcome? It's really difficult. The next part is, we mentioned records, but there's also the orchestration side, workflow. If we're going to automate rudimentary activities to either support existing processes or replace them so that people can be more productive, you have to have a predictable setup within a system to do that. We're imagining on our side a future where large language models can be used on both sides of this problem. So at the front, creating the what we call indexed values, or just the description of the document in a structured way. Key value pairs, if your folks listening know about that. Large language models can read through your documents, quote unquote, and then deliver back summary, key terms, and you can cater how it's constructing those with an existing list of terms that you want to make sure are tied in together, how those interoperate and relate, to eliminate the human portion of that, saying, I have to interpret this myself and I have to put those values in, versus the milliseconds it would take a large language model to do. So given you can get the confidence interval pretty high and repeatable with terabytes of information, which our customers have within our systems, we got a pretty good spot to say, hey, here's a competitive advantage for you. You have your data. We're not going to sell it. We're going to go use that to help train this model. And now all you have to do is send stuff in and it'll figure out what to do next.
Well,
The
I would
second,
be. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I'm always interested when people are talking about populating the large language model with, you've got internal data that is to you, but you also want to use this to train other things. What is the balance that is struck there when you're saying, we service this sort of industry, it's to benefit everybody that we can sort of learn from one and apply it to another. But obviously there are a lot of rules and also, internal policies about where my data is allowed to be, what you're allowed to do with it outside of the company. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the biggest barrier our customers have right now, is they want to leverage these open source or publicly available models, but they cannot, either through regulation or internal policy, share their data with these models. So there is no path to say, I'm going to take this data and send it up to Open APIs or OpenAI's API. It's a non-starter. They have to have private local LLMs. And if those continue to be available, they can leverage those, given they have a path to do that. And that's really where we're going as a company. We're saying you are already perfectly positioned with how you are interrelating and indexing your documents, records, and workflows inside the system. But we're going to take the next phase in something called a knowledge graph. Now, have you come across a knowledge graph in your team and history?
So I have heard the term, but I understand I am speaking with an expert, and perhaps some of our listeners might be a little unfamiliar. Why don't you start off with what it is, and then we'll move on with what you're about to say.
Absolutely. So I'll start simple. and then we'll grow to the more complex. So at the very base of this, there's three categories of maturity we need to think about. So first is data. Data is no context. It's just numbers on a page. So if you can imagine in your mind's eye a big text file and a bunch of numbers and letters on there, that's all data. Okay. Information is data with context. So when we're looking at a spreadsheet and you can see the labels in the columns, and then there's rows information, and they're all nicely organized, you've converted that data to information. To get to knowledge, you need to understand the context between pieces of information. So a patient, for example, and a blood pressure measurement are two pieces of information that need to be connected. And understanding that connection is how knowledge is built. And that's not computer knowledge, by the way. That's how humans do it too. First, we think about it, and then we start to make new connections. And you can think about the dynamic brain and how we make more wrinkles as we learn new things, right? We're doing the same things in our mind. A knowledge graph is saying the connections are as important as the piece of information. So a spreadsheet is the most rudimentary and something we're all used to since 30 years or so, right? A relational database then is how we structure that information. And we can do a simple connection between pieces of information in a relational database. That's great. A knowledge graph says every single piece of information is its own thing. It's called a node. The relationship between two pieces of information or two nodes is called an edge or a predicate, depending on which platform you use. Each of those can have their own qualitative information. So the relationship itself, you can think of Andrew has a child. Andrew and child are two bits of information, and the relationship defines what that connection is, rather than a connection exists. And pieces of information can have more than one bits of context. What that then does is creates in the back end what we know as knowledge graphs. These were really popularized in social media around 2014 or so. But now that we have this excitement around AI modeling, we're learning that combining a large language model with a knowledge graph is enough to create meaningful context for the domain that's articulated in the knowledge graph. To say it more simply, when I can add in my knowledge graph to my large language model, I remove hallucinations.
I was actually just going to circle back to the example, hey, how do I make my pizza dough more sticky? And they're like, well, you could add Elmer's glue because it knows it's sticky. But in this knowledge graph, it would understand Elmer's glue is not food.
That's exactly right. And what's more than that is it can be easy to set up a knowledge graph with your initial relational databases, okay? Because if there's a connection in the tables of the database, that can be easily converted to a relationship in a graph database. But the magic comes when expanding those connections for each of the nodes. It happens as a function of using a software. And it's not something that the person has to be thinking about with intention. For example, we don't think very hard around using email. We know what to go do. We type what we have, we go send it out. And I don't think most folks realize how much data is being transmitted beyond just their note in an email message. Knowledge graphs are the same way. No one has to understand how that's supposed to be put together. But if you create the right interface, and to tie this back to QFlow, that's our next version of our product, is taking the ability that we've made to create connections between those pieces of data, integrating with your data warehouses, and orchestrating that within workflow. That's the next logical evolution for us, is to say, we're going to make this more robust with knowledge graphs, and then we're going to give customers the option to connect that to the language model of their choice, because we have to, and I believe that this is true beyond our customers, and it will be how folks have to operate. Companies will be reticent to adopt AI if because of the risk of losing or exposing their data. And so trying to keep that while still using the large language models privately and locally will be the answer. Apple talked about this from the consumer perspective. When they did their recent release of Apple Intelligence, they talked a lot about you're going to do on device, you're going to have your data here. You don't have to send it out to someone else. And if you do, you're going to do that intentionally, informed consent, right? Now that that's in the psyche of most Americans, that Apple is doing that, that's going to become the expectation across the board. And that's where people are really going to see that differentiation. And honestly, that's where AI companies can lose. So depending on where they're sourcing their data and how they're approaching this, they can really mess up their models and training because they've suddenly are no longer able to access the thing to help train their model. And if you, there's been, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I've heard a what if scenario that is a little scary. If you continue to, source what's publicly available online, well, now we have first generation AI content creation tools putting stuff out into the internet. The next generation of AI tools is going to be learning from AI examples, and you get further and further away from what people actually want, which is, what is something that will be acceptable to a human user response. If you're pulling from things that were generated by the last generation of AI, how do you ever get better?
Yeah, it's that self-reinforcing spiral that it will just get worse and worse and worse and worse if that's their approach. And I think the big companies know that. They have to, right? They employ tons of smart people. We're getting glimpses of this on how they're trying to approach it with some of the recent news around Salesforce, for example, opting everybody in on Slack, that they're going to be able to take your data to train their model. And only Salesforce will be able to have that corpus of data as a competitive advantage. We're talking about OpenAI and content creators going and attacking them because they use their books and their blog posts and things like that. I think even Apple trained its AI model in a recent article using YouTube videos and how to train that. So the more that people put their information out there, the more these companies are going to try to capture it, because that's the only way that these models can improve. The time will come where these will start to specialize, and I think they'll become proprietary, to say, hey, we've taken this baseline, first gen. Honestly, ChatGPT is like way farther than first gen, but we have this baseline, and we're going to put in our prompt tuning on top of it, and then combine that with a knowledge graph, and now that's our competitive model. And you're going to start to see companies that are going to release their models on a subscription basis, is my prediction for the future.
And you're probably exactly right. And I should clarify, I shouldn't have used the term first gen. This is where I go back to it emerged into the public consciousness, but of course they had been doing it for, I think the full name is like Chat GPT 4 or something like this. And, they had been working on it for a while, but when it started getting people's attention, people start thinking of that as the first generation. Whereas, experts have been working on this for a long time to get it to here.
You're exactly right, Jeff. And probably everyone would agree with you more than me.
Wow.
No, this first came out like, January of 2022, right?
Right.
That's when it started.
Right.
I do have a great story if folks are wondering, though, like just to share the brilliance of doing this Chat GPT. 9 months prior to its launch, I was using local models for GPT. And just, bit of trivia, if anybody goes to trivia night, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers, if I didn't already say that. Their GPT-3, you could download and you could query directly on your laptops. And the difficulty there is you had to then know the statistical inputs to tune the results that you were getting. You couldn't use natural human language. You had to understand how the model was put together. I'm like, man, this is really hard for folks. No one's going to do this. And then 9 months later, you're right, they're not going to do it. You're just going to type into a chat bar and they're going to handle it for you in the back end. There you go. So I thought it was really smart.
One of the things that I hear over and over in so many conversations I have is that however good a tool is, a company's not going to buy it just because it works and just because it's interesting. There has to be a pain point within the industry that is being addressed. I have this challenge. I need a solution. Oh, here's a solution. You apply it to the business, and because it actually works and does its job, it is adapted and it is successful. So when I hear of an organization like QFlow that has this incredible approach to records management, document management, what is the actual like challenge or opportunity that your clients are looking for a solution, and then they come to be aware that you're out there? What are they trying to fix?
So the most of our initial customers that come through, their first problem is they have a huge backlog of files that have been either stored physically or digitally, and they can't retrieve them in a way that they have to. So that's where we start. There's been a local county, for example, came to us and said, we have 7 to 10 terabytes of PDFs that were scanned in that we are mandated by the state to maintain, and they're all on external drives. Can you offer us something smarter than that? Absolutely, we can. The next thing that comes up is the workflow that's built in. So you probably heard of Zapier in the past, where great guy from Mizzou here in Missouri, Wade. Shout out to Wade. They have a really strong, robust online orchestration tool. Well, we do that built into the software, so it's not a single purpose function like Zapier is. It's built in with robust automation, so you can take the metadata of these documents and then orchestrate it for approvals, for tracking, for audit logging. All that's built into the product. The record side is there's plenty of record retention schedules that have to be followed to meet industry standards. You have to have a log of that, and you have to have specific people in specific roles that evaluate and approve disposition or routing them to the National Archive, or whatever the next step phase is for that record. It has to be tracked. And so because that's built in out of the box, we can eliminate all of the customization that other companies provide. We can eliminate the confusion of where something is. And then finally, we can help them relate those documents to their business data. So we integrate with data warehouses, with API calls, with even spreadsheets in some cases, so that folks are able to connect the dots of their source of truth to the documents and then have that persist in a single system on top of robust permissions. So there might be a lot of things I can access that, Jeff, you shouldn't be able to access. That's fine. It's all built on metadata. So the reason why that's a differentiator is something like SharePoint or Google Drive or OneDrive or Box. The permissions are enforced based off of directory. So the folder has permissions or the file does. With our system, it's metadata driven. So when you change an index field, so let's say it goes from confidential to public, well, right there, the system automatically updates, and now everybody's permissions update along with it. And you didn't have to move the file at all. And a file in the same directory, quote unquote, can have a different set of permissions because it's based on the metadata, and you can organize it how you would best use it in your role.
That sounds incredible. And I know, one of the things that, again, it's a pain point in so many companies is we have all this legacy data. We have all of this stuff that, we're either required to keep for X number of years, or, hey, we were collecting it before this new tool came online and we sure wish we could put this into that. But, how do we do that? Using your kind of tool, you could translate it into something that is system agnostic, but still has retained permissions where, oh, that's not supposed to be external or internal. That's all built in. What a powerful tool.
Oh, thank you.
So I know I want to be respectful of your time here, and we only have so much left. We've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. If there were one or two key takeaways you hope people will think about a little further after listening to this episode, what would you want to highlight for them?
Yeah, I think the big messages that I'm trying to put out there today are, one, don't put too much faith and trust inside of these large language models if you don't have your data connected to them. That's where they're really going to do well for you. Two, be really cognizant of exposing your data to these models. So stay private, stay connected. And then I guess the last one is, keep an eye out for us as we're doing this new generation where we can have knowledge graphs and workflow and documents and other sources of truth connected up to really create a seamlessness and approachability to a company's data.
And I've got one more before I let you go. I think most of the people who would listen to an episode like this are actively trying to learn. They understand AI is coming. If it's not already here, they may be the person in their company who's making decisions about where to start. Now, you're a subject matter expert. What are questions you wish people were asking you when they're trying to educate themselves in this space?
I think as folks are going on their own journey to learn more about AI, machine learning, neural networks, things like this, I think it's best to start with the problems that this is intended to solve. So if they are, I don't think it would be valuable to look up those terms directly and try to figure out which is the right path. And instead start to look at your specific industry and what are the things that are ripe for automation. I would start there. And why I say automation is important is because when you can automate something, you necessarily can communicate that to a system, a computer, a server. And the AI is really meant to augment that automation. So we had a couple examples today of I have a 200-page report I need synthesized with the key bullet points. Well, that's your use case. You want to automate the summary. And that's what you're sending over to the AI. So as folks are learning more and thinking about this, there's tons of content that's out there. If you want to learn more about knowledge graphs, the most popular thing to learn from is called Neo4j. That's been around since 2014. The huge standard out there. It's what we use. If you want to learn more about the approaches to modeling, looking up the papers from Ilya over at OpenAI and what he's published starting in 2012. There's something like 150,000 citations along his papers. I definitely recommend reading that to understand the approaches.
Andrew, I really appreciate you getting into that level of detail where people can go for resources. I do actually probably want to say, I think we're never going to guess what their question is. At this point, the people who have listened to an episode with this kind of depth of knowledge and detail, they've got their own things that they want to do. So if they wanted to reach out to QFlow or yourself, ask their own questions, what's the best way to get in touch?
Oh, yeah, great. Definitely LinkedIn. Hit me up on LinkedIn out there. I connect with folks really easily. QFlow.com if you want to come learn more about our products and where we're going. And we even have a great future section out there on the new website for folks to see where we think we're going to go. And then the final one is a great software we started using about 3 months ago called Roam, ROAM, not like Rome, the city. And you can come into our virtual lobby. So ro.am/Hutson with a T. And you can come knock on my door and we can have a chat.
Fantastic. I always think it's so generous when people say you can contact me directly because, I get the pleasure of chatting with you, and anybody who, wants to talk to Andrew, I mean, there are ways to do it. So I encourage all of you to reach out if you've got some questions or are interested in QFlow or just, sort of want to see what's coming next. Andrew, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your kind questions and thoughtfulness and how we've discussed this topic. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
Absolutely. You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. I've been Jeff Mix. Let's do it again soon.